Good evening. Welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones and here to answer your questions, the Chief Executive of the Regional Australia Institute, Sue McCluskey, the Labor member for Perth, Alannah MacTiernan, Australian journalist Peter Greste, who spent 400 days in an Egyptian jail, former Northern Territory Labor Minister, now executive producer of National Indigenous TV News, Malarndirri McCarthy, and the Assistant Minister for Social Services, Manager of Government Business in the Senate, Mitch. Please welcome our panel. So remember, if you've got a live Twitter question, just add @Quanda to help us find it. We'll go straight to our first question from the floor, and it is from Bo Knight.
Thanks, Tony. This is a question for all panellists. There's been a lot of praise and support for the federal government's no jab, no pay policy. However, some of the most affluent areas in New South Wales boast the lowest vaccination rates, which would remain virtually unaffected by this policy. Is it time to... If the health and safety of our children is the greatest priority, is it time to follow nations such as France and implement restrictions to services such as school and childcare for those whose parents choose not to vaccinate?
Mitch Fifield, someone wants even greater restrictions.
Thanks. Well, I like the way you're thinking. I think it's just so important to make sure that children receive the vaccinations that they should have. It's not just a danger for that child, but it's also a danger for other children with whom they come in contact. Now, what we've put forward really relates to those areas where the Commonwealth has responsibility. So if people don't...
So not the eastern suburbs of Sydney, for example?
Yeah.
Is what he's suggesting?
That's right. But for people who refuse to have their children vaccinated, they will lose family tax benefit Part A, end of year supplement. They'll lose the childcare benefit. They'll lose the childcare rebate. You mentioned schools. What about stopping people attending school where they haven't been vaccinated? That's ultimately an area of state responsibility. The states run the schools. They determine enrolment policies. So that is fairly and squarely a matter for them. But you do raise the important point that those people who don't have their children vaccinated, often they're affluent people, well-educated people. And what that says to me is that there is still a very important role for education about the dangers of not vaccinating your kids.
Now, Mitch Fifield, there's still going to be some exemptions. Why make any exemptions at all for religious groups if the lives of children are indeed in danger?
Well, there are two important exemptions. One is for medical reasons, if a vaccination would interact in a bad way with some other treatments that someone's receiving, and I think we all accept that that's good and appropriate. We have severely restricted the previously fairly broad exemption that there was for conscientious objectors, and we saw 10 years ago only about 15,000 people below the age of 7 not being vaccinated. That's now come up to 40,000 people. So we've constrained that exemption. So you now have to
Why any exemption at all if the lives of children are in danger because their parents follow some religious belief? Why any restrictions? Well, any exemptions?
Look, we still think that there needs to be respect for genuinely held religious convictions. And so the exemption that is there is if an individual is a member of a denomination that has formally registered their religious objection with the government, then that is an avenue for genuine conscientious objection. But that is the only one. It's very narrow and we don't expect many people will take that up.
Malarndirri McCarthy.
I'd like to take it in a different direction. When we look at Indigenous people across the country, Tony, and the different places that they are, one of the biggest issues we have across Australia, in particular in Northern Australia, is the remoteness of families being able to access good health and good clinics and doctors and nurses. So the question I would certainly be looking at here, and I'm sure Aboriginal health organisations across the country would want to know this too, is what kind of extra support goes in for them to be able to reach these families, to be able to make sure these children are vaccinated so that they can have the quality of life. We talk about closing the gap in health. There are some serious fundamental issues still with general health issues for First Nations people.
Well, some Indigenous communities have 80% or lower children with full vaccination. I mean, are you saying this is simply a matter of the medical facilities not reaching them, or them not being able to reach?
I think it's more the
medical...
practical. It is about the practicalities of accessing for these families, whether they're in remote regions whether they can. And it's not just First Nations people. There's all sorts of people who live in the regions, and being able to have that access to good medical facilities is a critical issue.
So, Mitch, will exemptions be made here? Because obviously there's maybe some communities that can't access medical facilities as easily as others, and yet they may lose their welfare benefits.
Well, look, we're not going out of our ways to be punitive. What we're trying to do is to create an environment where the default is that you get your kids immunised. Obviously, if there are particular challenges in particular areas with people accessing doctors and accessing immunisation, then absolutely we'd want to take a look at that. But our objective is those people who've received bad information making there a financial incentive, a financial penalty, if you like, for people choosing what I think is a very bad path.
I've got another question on this. We'll go to that before we bring the other panellists in. It's from Caitlin Sudik.
Hi, so my question is, why should families be subject to mandatory parenting regulations from the government or taxpayers?
Peter Greste.
Well, look, I think it's quite clear that this is not just a question of individual responsibility, it's a question of social responsibility. When kids don't get vaccinated, it's not just those kids that are vulnerable. You encourage or you allow space for those illnesses to embed themselves in the community. And I know this can often feel like quite an abstract issue sometimes, particularly in a place like Australia where we're relatively secure from a lot of these illnesses. But, you know, I remember doing a story in the Dadaab refugee camp where polio, we saw a polio outbreak, and I've got to tell you, it was absolutely horrific to see the effect of a disease that I thought had been all but eradicated. I never expected to see it. I haven't seen it in this country, and yet in Dadaab we saw it rip through the community. We saw it rip through those people, and it had an absolutely devastating effect. And when you see that, when you see just how harmful those illnesses can be, once they get a foothold in the community that hasn't been vaccinated, you really understand that the far greater issue is not about the individual health, it's about the community health.
Alannah MacTiernan.
Absolutely, totally agree with that. I actually
you support the government's punitive approach, do you?
I support this, recognising this just as not a matter of individual choice. That you need around, you know, for illnesses like whooping cough, diphtheria, polio, you need about a 90% coverage. It's a question of you have to have 90% of the herd covered for these vaccinations to be effective. I actually personally had my daughter had whooping cough at 3 weeks. So before she was able to be vaccinated, she contracted whooping cough. So it's a huge problem. But can I just say to Mitch, I mean, I understand the Commonwealth is saying that they're doing what they can and targeting areas where there's Commonwealth responsibility, but very mindful of the question. The federal government funds private schools. Would you consider, as part of the packaging of funding, providing funding for private schools, that a similar requirement is brought into account, which might help deal with this question of equity?
Well, we don't just provide money towards private schools. The Commonwealth also provides significant money through the states to state schools as well. But whether it's private schools or whether it's state schools, the responsibility for the state and private school education system rests with state governments. Now, we'll focus on those things that we're able to do and have control of, but as long as we've got state governments, they've actually got to do something. They've actually got to take responsibility for those things which are within their purview.
Okay, let's hear from Sue McCluskey.
Thank you. And Caitlin, look, it really is about better health outcomes, and that's what's really important. And as part of this, what we're doing is we're taking a carrot and stick approach from what we can see. And it's important to do that because, from what Bo said, you know, there are people in areas that are just not vaccinating because they don't want to. And so there is a need to try and make sure that there are ways to try and get them to get their children vaccinated, because it is important in terms of those broader outcomes. But, you know, we do know in the remote areas and even some of those rural areas that it is very hard to get access to the sort of health services that we need. So it is about providing what are the incentives that we need to ensure that parents are educated so they can see the real need to contribute to the better health of all Australians.
OK, it's time to move along. We've got a lot of different questions on different subjects. Our next question comes from Sean Mack.
My question is to Peter Greste. Peter, we closely followed your experience over more than a year, 400 days, and listened to, with a great deal of interest, what the sorts of things your family were saying about how you were holding up during that time. I'd like to know, from that experience, what did you learn about personal resilience?
That I'm tougher than I thought I was, and I think most people are probably a good deal tougher than they think they are. Look, I dare say that every person in this room and every person who actually paid a great deal any attention to our case, at some point, imagine how they'd cope if they were in my situation. And I'll tell you now that if you'd have told me beforehand that I'd have to spend 400 days in a prison cell, in an Egyptian prison cell, I'd have told you that I'd gone nuts, absolutely nuts. I wouldn't have believed that I'd have been able to cope with it. And so I guess one of the key lessons is that not only am I a lot stronger than I think, but I'm pretty sure everybody here is a lot stronger than I think. And in a lot of ways, I feel quite fortunate because I've been, you know, I've had my limits tested and discovered that my limits are actually a lot further than I imagined. The problem with most people is that they're never placed in that kind of situation, and so they never really know or understand just how strong they actually are.
And your two co-workers are still being tested as we speak.
That's right. They're still on trial. They're out on bail at the moment, Tony. The next hearing is on the 22nd of this month. Obviously, we're quite concerned about it, but I guess the fact that they're out on bail is a positive sign. We're just hopeful that the Egyptian judicial system is, sees this through. And I'm still technically on trial as well, as you mentioned, which is also still quite concerning. So this is an ongoing fight for us.
We'll move straight to the next question, which is on the same subject, a bit broader. It's from Alexander Hearn.
This is a question for Peter. The last year was one of the highest on record for the number of journalists jailed globally. Even with the massive international pressure and campaigning it took over 12 months to secure the release from your release from jail in Egypt. So what hope is there for other journalists locked up in big journalist jailing countries like China, Iran and Turkey?
Yeah, look, this is a big problem. There were 220 journalists that were arrested, that were in detention at the end of last year, and I guess I'm not quite sure where that figure stands today, but perhaps slightly less, perhaps slightly more. I was one of those statistics. I would like to think that the outcry around our arrest, around our case, has given governments pause for thought, made them think again a little bit about the wisdom of detaining journalists. I'm pretty sure that Egypt is perhaps thinking twice about whether it goes down a similar route.
One of the interesting things that, or the points you made in your press club speech was that 75% of those journalists in jail were jailed like you were on terrorism charges.
Yeah, or crimes against the state. And I think this is one of the biggest concerns. And I mentioned in that press club speech that I think one of the problems that we've got is the war on terror and the way that places journalists at odds with governments, because by simply, the way that terrorism is defined at the moment, by simply interrogating some of these issues, by picking up the telephone and calling people who are considered to be terrorists by the government, you're placing yourself in the sights of the security institutions. And while there may be some justification in controlling terrorism and monitoring what terrorist groups are up to,
in this case, you're actually picking up the phone and talking to the people who were members of the former government who'd been overthrown.
That's right. The Muslim Brotherhood was the government up only 6 months before we arrived, and I still think they were one of the largest and most significant political organisations in the country. So what we were doing was our jobs as journalists. But the problem is that when you start going down that route, immediately you put yourself in the line of fire. And the problem also is it's not just governments, obviously, that are attacking journalists and locking journalists up, but it's the extremists themselves. ISIS, of course, has taken their heads off 3 journalists. And, of course, we also saw the attack on the Charlie Hebdo offices in Paris, which is, I think, a part of the same conflict. And so what we're seeing now, I think, is a form of globalised McCarthyism where journalism itself is under fire in the way that we haven't seen for a generation.
We'll come back to that because we've got another question on that later. Malarndirri, the idea that journalism is now a kind of profession where you can find yourself in jail for long periods of time, it's always been dangerous in different parts of the world. But what do you say to that questioner?
Look, it's certainly quite confronting, actually, just listening to Peter. And can I just say, Pete, if I can throw this in, Tony, just from all of us at SBS and NITV, it is so wonderful to have you back in the country.
Thank you.
I mean, the incredible effort that went into just here in this country to support your release. And I just want to throw that in there. Look, Tony, I think in terms of where we're going as a nation, we need to reflect on the fact that we're about to come up to our centenary in terms of the Anzacs. And we have to remember what our values are as a nation. What is it that our country stands for? When we reflect coming up on Anzac Day, that the values in terms of fighting for freedom and democracy, and that, I think, has to resonate quite deeply in this country. When we look at where we are 100 years later, struggling as freedom of the press, wondering what our future is to be able to tell those stories, I think that's a real concern, a massive concern for journalists and for this country. I mean, we have to have freedom of the press, and we have to be able to do it without thinking that if I follow this particular story, am I going to be arrested? Am I going to be put into jail? And if there's stories that need to be told, we should be able to continue to tell those stories.
I'll just come quickly back to Peter, because one of the things you cooked up, in fact, with one of your co-accused in jail was the idea of having an international media freedom charter. Briefly, tell us what that is, and we'll bring the other panellists in after that.
Well, what we're trying to do is come up with some form of document that has considerable moral authority that might be able to hold both governments and news organisations to a particular standard that sets out the way that relationship should work. There are a number of charters and a number of agreements and so on, and treaties that do exist at the moment, but nothing seems to be working as effectively as it should be. Now, this idea is something we're looking at very, very closely, and we're holding a number of meetings at the moment. The World Press Freedom Day conference in Riga, which is coming up at the beginning of May, is something where we're going to be taking this idea forward. That may be the way to go. There may be other routes. There are quite a number of options. We're still at early days, but clearly what we need to do is try and find a way of holding governments to account, of setting a standard, setting a very clear definition of what is appropriate and what is not. Because, as we've already heard, 220 journalists in prison at the end of last year, more than 80 journalists, I think, were murdered, were killed last year. So the numbers are really pretty horrific. Down slightly on the year before, that the last 3 years have been the most serious, seen the highest number of journalist deaths since records began in 1991. So we have a very serious problem that needs to be addressed. But you're not talking about a set of laws, are you? You're talking about a set of moral principles or guidelines? Yeah, I think a set of laws are going to be too complicated. I mean, the current international environment, that's not going to work. But we need something with moral authority. Mitch, does that attract you as a member of a government?
Well, I guess firstly, Peter...
Could conflict with a few of your laws, that's what I'm...
Well, look, I think firstly we've got to acknowledge that Peter has earned the right through his unique commitment to freedom of the press to have any proposition that he puts forward seriously looked at. Peter mentioned that there are some existing international safeguards, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which goes to issues of freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, and there's also the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which covers similar territory. And I think we've got to do two things. One is see why those particular international protections at the moment are not adequately respected, and what can we do to see that they are more respected. And secondly, to see if there are any other mechanisms that we can look at to reinforce that. So I'm very happy to look at the proposition that Peter's putting forward.
MacTiernan?
And can I also add, pay my respects to Peter and the fantastic role model he has been. But can I just just being the devil's advocate just to make this a little bit more interesting here, because I don't think we should always think that journalists are saints. And so we obviously look at what happened in the United Kingdom, where we had journalists behaving in an incredibly appalling way, and indeed are acting at the behest of their large media mogul owner in fact advancing their interests rather than the interests of freedom. So I think when we're talking about the moral authority of journalists and protecting it, we need to look at in fact what they're doing, and not always are they out there arguing for peace and fairness in the community.
I'm not suggesting at all that journalists are saints. What I'm suggesting two things. First of all, that we need to establish a kind of a benchmark for the relationship and the responsibilities and roles that both should have. But there was also a French philosopher who said that a free press, of course, can be both good and bad, but a press that is not free can never be anything but bad. And that's what we need to bear in mind.
Oh, and totally agree with that. And we just need to understand, to be sure, that it is actually a free press that we're talking about and not advancing a particular interest.
I'm told there's a hand in the audience. I can't see it at the moment, but I'm sure we'll get a microphone. Yes, there's a gentleman down the front there. Go ahead.
My question's to Senator Fifield and the panel. Senator, given that the Abbott government ignores the Universal Declaration on Human Rights in relation to children in detention and a number of other matters, and given that Australia doesn't have a Bill of Rights, one of the only Western democracies in the world not to have one, which is a disgrace. New Zealand has one, by the way. Why is it that you would cite them? But my question is, will the Prime Minister and yourself support a media or journalist charter of protection, given your draconian metadata laws? Don't you think that's really important?
Okay, I'll tell you what, I'm going to take this as a comment because we're going to come back to that issue of metadata in a moment, but I do want to hear from Sue McCluskey on the previous question that was asked. We'll come back to that point.
Well, look, certainly when it comes to the media in this day and age, we depend on the media. It's 24/7, and so in that context, transparency is so important, freedom of the press is important, and we would rather see that than not have it.
Ms Fifield, I'll just get you to pick up one part of what our questioner said, a suggestion that this particular government wouldn't necessarily welcome intervention from UN laws or statutes.
Well, we are, as a government, are a great respecter of international conventions, and we don't accept that our detention policies are in contravention of our international obligations. So I'll put that on the record. In terms of metadata,
we'll come back to that issue. We've got another question. It's from Eliza Balaj.
Yep. So my question's for Peter Greste and for McCarthy, and it's about metadata. The new metadata protections for journalists have actually been described by Senator Nick Xenophon as stabbing investigative journalism in the heart. And they are raising a lot of concerns, including for confidential sources, for whistleblowers, and they also raise concerns for freelancers like myself because they're deemed to only cover professionally employed journalists. And as we know, the industry is turning more and more to freelancers. As practicing journalists and those working in the media, what do you feel these protection laws mean?
Look, for me, this is a bit of a softball, really. I agree with you completely that it's a real problem. I think it has a very chilling effect on the work of journalists. One of the problems with the legislation is that you're never really quite sure when you're breaking the law and when you're not, because the legislation has us breaking the law if you inadvertently disclose information about a security operation. The problem is that we're never told, by definition, because it's a classified security operation, we're never told when that might be, and so you're never quite sure. And of course, the default position is going to be, or the instinctive position is going to be, to play it more conservatively. And I think that's a really serious problem. The issue of the public interest advocates is another one. Those advocates don't have any communication with the journalist. They've got no way of being able to argue the journalist's case in front of the courts. So I don't think that is. They
operate in secret, effectively. Or they will, because they don't exist yet, but they will operate in secret.
They will operate in secret, and I don't think that they can ever possibly advocate for the public if they really don't understand what the story is, and they're not going to know that if they can't speak to the journalist and explain what's going on. Equally, the protections, there may be some protections, the fact that these tribunals exist, protect the journalists, but they don't protect, as you said, the freelancers, and they certainly don't stop the authorities from going after the whistleblowers themselves. And for all of these reasons, I think we seriously degrade the ability of journalists to do that fourth estate role, and that's act as an oversight and as a public's eyes and ears on the government. I think it's really seriously.
Let's hear from Mitch Fifield on that.
Yeah, look, I think that there is an important role for government to ensure that sensitive investigations are not compromised by information which comes into the public domain. It's also can be important in terms of the safety of investigating staff in relation to certain matters. On that issue, we'd probably agree to disagree. But the questioner also, Tony, touched on the issue of metadata. And I know it's been presented that the government's legislation in relation to metadata in some way is intrusive or takes away from existing freedoms. What the government has done with metadata is not to change in any way, shape or form the circumstances under which that data can be accessed. Because of changing technology, because of changing billing practices by certain organisations, metadata, which previously might have been held for a period of time, is held for a shorter period of time. So what we have
It's simply the means by which to find out who, for example, with journalists, the confidential sources are. So if you have access to the metadata, that means you have access to all the people who rang the journalist or who the journalist has rung, and therefore you're able to identify confidential sources in this manner. So why do you need to do that?
Well, before the legislation that we put in place came to pass, it was already the case that law enforcement authorities could access that information. What we've done is actually introduced some protections which didn't previously exist.
But these are the ones Peter was just talking about. So go ahead. I mean, you can explain this point.
I mean, I think to a certain extent, I think those protections are a form of a fig leaf, because I don't really think that they provide some sort of superficial protection to journalists, but they don't resolve the problem, and that is allowing whistleblowers or the journalists and their sources, and particularly their sources, the security that they need. The problem is that there is in this relationship there is always a trade-off between security and public freedoms, and what we're doing is moving the slider away from towards security and eroding public freedom in the process. And the thing that worries me, is that by degrading the ability of journalists to do their jobs, to keep track of what the government does in all sorts of areas, we're creating a lot of dark spaces within the government where bad things can easily happen.
I want to hear the rest of the panel on this, but Mitch, you can answer that point.
Sure. We've actually moved the slider towards journalists because previously there were no protections. We've done three important things. One is reduced the number of investigative agencies who can access metadata from 80 to 20. So it's essentially now the police, anti-corruption bodies and economic regulators. We've also put in place a role for the Commonwealth Ombudsman, which didn't previously exist. And we've also put in place that you need warrants to access metadata that journalists have. That is a protection that was not previously in place. So we've actually put three important safeguards in place that were not there prior to our legislation. And in fact, those law enforcement agencies could access metadata previously. What we've done is added additional protections which did not previously exist. Plus,
the Minister for Communications is now advising journalists and their sources, i.e. whistleblowers, to use encrypted communications.
Well, Malcolm is a commentator on a range of issues and puts a lot of information in the public domain.
Malarndirri, are you relieved to hear what you're hearing?
No, I listen to Pete and I go, yep, the degrading of the journalist's role is what's clear here in terms of following a story, and I think it's the practical steps here, Senator, and this is where, if you can just walk me through this.
Sure.
You know, we're chasing a story, we're following it up. If I think of a story that I covered a couple of years ago with two Aboriginal brothers in Saudi Arabia, at what point do you think along the way, as you're trying to examine and unpack the issue that's affecting them and their lives and their families, at some point there, are you saying that we've got to also take into consideration checking or touching base with this investigative group that monitors what we're doing? Is that how it works?
Well, journalists,
explain that to me.
Yeah, journalists are not the target of our metadata legislation, and in fact,
they're just collateral damage.
Well, no, not at all, not at all. You know, can I make a? I guess it might be a self-evident point that metadata existed before our recent legislation. Metadata existed before this legislation, and law enforcement agencies were able to access it before our legislation. And the manner in which law enforcement agencies can access metadata has not changed as a result of our legislation. The only changes are...
Isn't the metadata going to be now kept for very long periods of time, where otherwise it would have been destroyed?
That is the only change, is that
it's a pretty big change. Doesn't that mean you can go back infinitely to find out what people have been saying and saying to each other?
Well, the circumstances in which law enforcement agencies can access metadata has not changed. What we have required is that the metadata be held for a longer period of time, but the circumstances under which it can be accessed have not changed. Right. What we have done in relation to journalists is introduce the requirement for a warrant that didn't previously exist. We've got the Commonwealth Ombudsman providing oversight, and we've reduced the number of investigative agencies who can access metadata. So there are protections now that didn't previously exist.
All right, I'm going to go to Alannah McTiernan, because you obviously, the Labor Party obviously voted for this legislation, so you must think it's a good piece of legislation.
Oh, look, I don't think any of us suggest that this is other than a very difficult line to draw. You know, where do we draw the line between the rights and needs, or the needs, of law enforcement? And it is primarily a law enforcement mechanism rather than, although it's been sold as a terrorism mechanism, its fundamental, its most frequent use is in law enforcement. So you're absolutely right. There's got to be a real debate about where it is we draw the line. Mitch,
is it a bit late for the debate once you've voted for the legislation?
Well, I just need to explain this, and I'm sorry, you can't do this in 30 seconds or less. But we made a commitment to be bipartisan on national security. There's obviously, this was introduced into the Parliament as a national security legislation. Now
But you actually, I think you just said it, didn't you just say a moment ago that actually it is used primarily?
Really, it is used primarily. I think my understanding that probably around 80% plus of its use is for law enforcement, but certainly there is a use of it in relation to the intelligence agencies are using it. So it's a question, you know, we get this evidence, we demand that there is a public inquiry, that we have a Senate inquiry. All of those protections that Mitch was talking about, in fact, were protections that weren't in the legislation to begin with and were instituted as a result of these negotiations. And
so did you negotiate for a secret process that no journalist will be able to see? Is that part of the Labor's negotiation?
No, and I have to say, look, this is not an issue that has been easy for anyone, and I still think we're some time down before the legislation comes into effect. I think as we start looking at the complexity of it, we might, who knows, we may see further changes. But I do want to say, I think what we need is to be a bit more honest and open about this. And I think the real tragedy was, I think we did need legislation. Over 300,000 requests per year are being granted to access to data. So it's not as if people are not accessing your data now. Over 300,000 requests a year. So clearly an issue. But I think that this is the type of thing where we needed to have a mature debate, not Tony Abbott lobbing it into the Parliament, saying this is a national security issue. Labor and, you know, trying to pull back and say, come on, let's have a public inquiry. This should have actually been the sort of thing that we dealt with as a Green Paper, where we put all that evidence out to the community.
That sort of begs the question as to why you voted for it.
Well, no,
you could have crossed the floor, Alannah.
I'm sorry. We made the decision at the end that the amendments that we had, and this was, you know, wasn't without a debate, but on balance a decision had to be made, and a decision with the majority of people firmly took the view that that drawing the point here was a fair point in which to draw it. Now, this is not to say that in any way we undervalue the significance of this, and we don't say that it's a no-brainer. We don't say, and as I said, I just think the whole history of this, we tried to come in after the legislation was introduced, you know, went through months and months of process and try to improve it, and I think we did get substantial improvement.
I just would like to hear from Sue. Sue, you've been listening to this, and I'm just wondering what you make of this debate and whether you're concerned on behalf of journalists or whether you think it's a good way to deal with public information, or deal with private information, I should say.
Well, let's look at the metadata issue more broadly, and that is we have a growing need for data. We collect more and more data all of the time. And data is really important to be able to help us make decisions. You know, my institute collects a wealth of data on the regions and allows you to actually help get evidence-based decisions, evidence-based policy. But what we've got to be able to do is, at the same time as we're discussing how we can actually access that data, is be able to make sure we have the right balance about protecting people's privacy and to be able to make sure that that really is protected. And we need to be able to have that mature discussion about that, because the need for data, the collection of data and the need to access it will just continue to grow.
Okay, listening to the concerns of the journalists on the panel, do you feel that the government got this right, and the opposition for that matter who voted for it?
Look, I think that the journalists themselves have concern about where the exemptions come in. I think that really the legislation itself, given that it's been voted for now, we've actually got to look at how that actually does play out. There's always the opportunity to go back and see and make sure that you can say what works in practice, and if we need to amend it, then there's a need to do that.
Gentleman with his hand up there, we'll quickly go to you. Comment or question?
Yeah, is it naive?
Make it brief, though.
Yeah, is it naive for us to store every Australian's metadata because for several years, because we can retroactively go back and rejudge everyone with a McCarthyism, every single Australian, I mean, you're talking about journalists, but for every Australian in this room can be rejudged in 5 years' time as if you were an animal freedom person, you could be judged if an incident happened adversely in 5 years' time.
Okay, let's hear Peter on this. I mean, you used the word McCarthyism earlier, but it was actually to do with the use of terrorism as an excuse. I mean, you say, in fact, you've said in your press speech that governments use the T word in order to press these kind of issues. Do you exclude Australia from that?
No, I don't. I think that, you know, terrorism is clearly a big issue, but I'm not understating it. I'm not trying to minimise the impact of terrorism on the community, but I think that there is a real danger that terrorism is used as a kind of scare tactic, as this way of the government taking this as an opportunity to impose all sorts of draconian restrictions and limitations, which it would never get away with under other circumstances. And I think we need to be very careful about slipping into the trap of accepting terrorism as an excuse for all sorts of controls that we wouldn't under other circumstances.
Tony, if I can just quickly make the point that...
We need to be quick because we've got to get a few other questions.
Sure. The government isn't copying or storing metadata. It's held by the organisations. Access is only sought in the pursuit of a criminal investigation. And metadata is very important to investigations in relation to murder, rape, child sexual abuse. It's an important piece of information for investigators.
Someone's got a singing telephone. If they could just turn it off, that'd be great. Now, Q&A is live across Australia, simulcast on iView, News Radio and Australia Plus. Our next question tonight comes from Sam Bailey.
Christovichans once contended that as long as the sacred texts of Islam, the Quran and the Hadith, are respected and upheld, Islamic extremists will always find divine warranty and authorization for their horrific acts of violence. So, is it time to tackle the problem of terror and conflict at its roots and acknowledge that this pressing issue is an intrinsic part of the Islamic religion?
I'll start with Alannah.
Thanks. Look, there is no doubt that there are statements in the Quran that can be utilised to justify the terrorist act. But I think if you look at the fact that the vast majority of Muslims are people that are law-abiding, great, you look in Australia, great citizens, that I don't think that the problem is fundamentally a problem of Islam. I think there is clearly a major sort of cultural issue that has emerged in the Middle East. I mean, we've got people that, as we know, that don't come from an Islamic background that convert to Islam seemingly in order to involve themselves in these sorts of disputes. So I would be very reluctant to say that that really Islam is the cause, because you look at the vast majority of Islamic people and they are repelled and condemn these activities.
Sue McCluskey.
Look, I agree with Alannah. We're a multicultural society and we can't judge what happens by the acts of what is a minority. And, you know, we've got to continue to make sure we embrace multiculturalism. It makes up the very fabric of our country. And if we are to be directed by those actions of those few, I think we will end up in a very different and sadder place than where we want to be.
I'll just quickly go, I'll come to you in a minute, Peter. Sam Bailey, listening to this, do you have serious concerns, or is yours got a philosophical concern drawn from the writings of Christopher Hitchens?
Probably the second one, yeah. But I just think that they miss the point. They have warranty in the Quran and the Hadith to do that. I'm not talking about the vast majority. The vast majority are good people. I'm talking about the actual religion, which gives them authority to do that.
Peter?
I think if you dig around in the Bible, you'll find plenty of excuses as well. Look, there are 1.5 billion Muslims in the world today. 23% of the world's population is Islamic. We're not at war with 23% of the world's population. 23% of the world's population isn't using that. And as I said, we can dig around and find all sorts of excuses. This is essentially, to my mind, this is one of the biggest problems. This is not a clash of civilizations. This is the abuse of a religious philosophy by a number of extremists who are using that ideology as a way of legitimizing and justifying all sorts of acts of terror and crimes which are essentially driven or motivated by other political issues. This is not a clash of civilization. Look, the danger of talking about it in this way is to demonize a massive chunk of the world's population. I think it's incredibly dangerous to start talking along those lines.
Yeah, it's sort of ironic, isn't it? I mean, you were accused in Egypt of essentially siding with Islamic extremists, but the really horrible irony in that is what happened to your producer in Somalia. I don't know if you can sort of tell us that story.
Yeah, I was with Kate Payton. We'd just gone to Mogadishu to cover Somalia. This was back in 2005, and it was after an extended period in which the government had been forced into exile. And they were planning to go back into Mogadishu because it was judged that things had stabilised a little bit. And we'd gone back around that time to try and do some stories looking at the way that, or the type of country, the state of the country. Journalists hadn't been in there for a very long time. And we just arrived. We'd gone in to visit some of the government delegation that had gone to pave the way for the arrival of the government. And as we walked out, someone took a shot at us, and it hit Kate in the back. And she fell to the ground, and we put her in the vehicle. She was still alive and conscious, and we got her to hospital, and she died in surgery, or after surgery a few hours later. And this was an attack by extremists who were determined to keep, we believed, to keep the West and other, and not just journalists, but foreigners in general and the government out of Mogadishu, because there were people who were exploiting that insecurity, using it to run drugs, to run people, to run weapons in and out of the city, who were exploiting the war economy. So, and this comes back to what I was saying, that Islam is being used and abused by people who have very specific political agendas.
Can you just explain one thing for us? I'm sure most of the audience would be interested in your take on this. Why are so many young Muslims, and even from affluent families throughout Europe and other places, including Australia, why are they so attracted to ISIS?
This is one of the things. There's a lot of talk about how disaffected youth seem to be winding up in these places, and I think that's a great myth. There is a sense amongst the Islamic community, the Islamic world, that Islam is under attack. Now, I'm not suggesting that it is. I'm simply trying to explain the logic that a lot of these kids are adopting. There is a sense that...
Do you think they have a point?
When I speak to them, it's hard to disagree, or it's hard not to see their point of view. I mean, they're incredibly angry with the way that Muslims are treated by the Israelis, for example, and the way that the West seems to be supporting Israel. They're incredibly angry at the way that the United States and its allies have behaved in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so what they see, and they respond to these kinds of millennial statements from the Americans, who talk about the war on terror, who talk about a clash of civilizations, and they take that to mean themselves, and they feel a moral obligation to go out and join that fight. There is also a
do they miss the central point that the group they're joining is committing abysmal and horrible brutalities on people of other religions?
There are two things here. I think one is that there is, for them, there is a very clear moral clarity, which is very seductive in itself. These guys see that there is a very clear sense of right and wrong. They argue that the West is bombing civilians with airstrikes, with drone attacks and so on. And their argument is that if they're doing it to us, then we have to do it back. Now again, I'm not endorsing that by any stretch of the imagination, but we have to understand the kind of logic that drives this forward if we're ever going to deal with this problem. And as I said, there is a sense of adventure and there is a sense of romance. They want to be part of something that is very pure ideologically. They want to be part of something that has a great deal of moral clarity. And it is seductively moral and clear-cut as far as they're concerned.
Mitch Fifield, is the government in danger of not seeing both sides of these very complex issues?
Oh, look, I don't think anyone in government, indeed I don't think anyone in the Parliament wants any part of the Australian community to feel that they're being targeted or held out to be different to the mainstream Australian community. I mean, I take Peter's point that I think one of the challenges is that everyone wants to feel that they're part of something bigger than themselves. ISIS and other terrorist organisations have proven to be pretty effective at presenting themselves as being a cause that is bigger than the individual, and that can be a seductive proposition. I think what's important in Australia is that we recognise that the greatest protection that we have against radicalisation is the quality and the robustness of our political culture. That we are lucky that we live in a pluralistic society where diversity and difference of opinion is tolerated. If we didn't have that political culture, we would have many more people in Australia who were attracted and radicalised. So we must protect the political culture that we have in Australia.
All right, we've got another question. We've got another question that touches on this, and I'll go to that first, and then we'll come back to the panel. But it's a question from Rochelle Ritchie.
In light of the overwhelming press that the hashtags Charlie Hebdo, Germanwings and African Lives Matter received, are the hashtags furthering the dehumanisation of these international attacks and disasters? And furthermore, are attacks like the Garissa University attack in Kenya that don't come up with a press package and hashtag ever as likely to receive such a worldwide response?
Malarndirri, I kept you out of that last discussion. I'll bring you in on this one.
Yeah, look, I did want to. Can I just, Rochelle? Sorry, I just want to pick up on the previous question when Pete pointed out disaffected youth, and if we can look at the disaffected youth in this country, and even going back to Sam's question there about religion, unless we can deal with the issues in this country, unless we can work on the issues that we have in this country with the First Nations people and our own youth right across this country, whatever nationality they may be, we have disaffected youth in this country. And the rates of suicide in this country, the rates of depression, and all of these factors, the social factors that impact on our young in this country, is what we should be dealing with. We should be dealing with this because we should be, as a nation, confirming to our youth that they have a future here that's worth living for. How many suicides we have across this country, especially in our Aboriginal communities, is an absolute disgrace in this nation.
Malarndirri, I'll just bring you back to the question there, which was really about the attack on Garissa University in Kenya and the sort of horrific toll of that, and yet the coverage of it is nothing quite like what we saw in other cases.
Rochelle, if I can go to your question now, in terms of what's happening overseas with the university, but also when I think about what's happening with the Ebola crisis, just the other day we had the African health workers saying, what about us? we're the ones who are in the front line. And yes, when these incidents happen in these African communities and different places, you've got to ask, why do we only hear about the bad news? Why do we only hear when they've got the most extreme cases, like in this case, an incredible tragedy? But there are other issues going on where you do have people in the front line trying to make a difference for their communities, for their regions. Where are those stories? And I refer to the Ebola crisis because the African group that was speaking was saying that here we have the health workers in the front line who have been the ones who've been dealing with this issue, and yet all we hear about is the doctors from Canada or from the UK, from the US. What about the very people who live in these places that allow these foreigners to be able to go in and do what they need to do?
Peter, I'll bring you in on this. I mean, you've worked extensively in Africa, and you were talking about Somalia earlier. But I mean, if that attack had happened in a Western country, if a university had taken hundreds of casualties and hundreds of deaths as a result of a terrorist attack, this would be, well, the world would change.
Yeah, it would, wouldn't it? Look, the problem is I worked in Kenya for the past 7 or 8 years, and I'd be in Greste now if I wasn't here, if I wasn't stuck here. We cover the stories as foreign correspondents that our audiences are interested in, and they're interested in the things that we cover. It's a kind of bit of a circular problem. I said this, another remark that I made at the press club was that I'm decrying the lack of foreign news coverage in this country. I think it's something that we're all poor because of it, because there is so little money that's invested in foreign news. And I think it is really, really important. We need to be much more aware of what's going on in places like Garissa, because if we ignore it, it'll come back to bite us on the arse.
Sue. Oh, sorry, Alannah wanted to get in. I beg your pardon. Go ahead.
Yeah,
I'll come back
can
to
I just say on this question of Islam, about 100 years ago, there was a very strong feeling amongst a lot of Australians that Irish Catholics were fundamentally suspect. You had the Easter uprising in the middle of the war. The statements that were made about the fact that Catholics wanted to ultimately, if they were given their way and allowed to have schools, etc., that what they'd do is to take Australia out of its allegiance with Britain and take it over to Rome. I mean, I just think that we've got to accept here that we've moved on from that. It now seems laughable that people would have actually thought that. And so the same thing with Islam. We've really got to accept this is the religion that people came to this country with, and we have to make sure with all our language. And Mitch, can I just say some of the things that were done with the racial discrimination attempts to change that, some of the Prime Minister's language about whether or not the Islamic leaders were doing enough, I think has not been helpful in us trying to ensure that that Muslim Australians feel that they are totally accepted as full Australians. So I think it's really keeping the glue of a multicultural society together is tough, and we need to be very, very careful about the things that, the sort of messages that we might send out when we're in a leadership position.
Okay, we're running out of time. We've got another question on different subjects from Ludo Mies.
My question is for Sue McCluskey. So recently the Prime Minister supported the closure of a large number of remote settlements in Western Australia, commenting that Australia could not endlessly subsidise the so-called lifestyle choices of Indigenous Australians living in their communities. At the same time, many Australian regional cities are heavily subsidised by federal or state governments and have in some cases effectively been financially bailed out. For example, the bailout of the SPC Alannah factory last year. So what are your thoughts on the settlement closure plans? And applying the same logic, is it time to rethink whether regional cities that cannot support themselves should continue to be financially supported by the government?
Sue.
Thank you, Ludo. Look, first of all, a third of our population lives in regional Australia. So that's a lot of people that live there that and form a very important part of our country. 1 in 15 people live in some of those more regional areas. So it's very important that we look at that. You talked about Indigenous communities. We like to say it's about place, not race. So what we need to do is have a look at where the communities are. A lot of them are sustainable. Just because they're small or remote doesn't mean they're not proactive and very productive communities. For example, I was at a community called Mount Margaret, which is between Leonora and Laverton in Western Australia. It is an Indigenous community. It is very productive. It's got a school. It's got a police force. It's got people that are very proactively adding to that community. So we can't actually take a one-size-fits-all approach and say you've just got to shut them down on size. You've also then got to look at the fact that it's not easy to move people. So once again, you know, in Western Australia, the town of Wittenoom, the asbestos town that people would know about, do you know, even up until really recently, there were still 6 people living in that town. So it's just not that easy to pick people up and say, we're going to close your town down. On the other hand, if you actually can work with the community to say, how can we talk about relocating you? That's when you start to get engagement. And we saw that in Grantham in Queensland. Following the floods, they actually managed to relocate about 80% of that community to higher ground. So what is very important about these communities is about saying that one size doesn't fit all. It's not about shutting them down. It's about having a conversation with people in the community. Does it mean relocation? Where will those impacts be? Are these towns productive? What does it mean to actually make sure that they can continue to be proactively contributing to the economic fabric of the regions, which are just so important?
Malarndirri.
Sue's right, it's about conversations. Unfortunately, I don't think those conversations ever began, Sue. We've got over 150 communities that are certainly questioning their future now in terms of essential services that are going to be and proposed to be withdrawn. We just saw on Friday, Tony, you know, 4,000 to 5,000 people in Melbourne, which is a long way from WA, but there's still absolute concern right across this country on the way these decisions are being made. Let me tell you, the First Nations people in WA, and certainly the people that we spoke to, as some of our NITV news journalists went at Craig Quartermain, Danny Teese-Johnson and spoke to people. And they just said they won't leave country, you know, they will stay there because it is about the spirituality and the cultural affinity to that country. So I think if you're not having the conversation to begin with, you're setting yourself up for an incredibly big battle.
Is there an economic rationale to close down any of these communities?
It always comes back to economics, doesn't it, Tony, for non-Indigenous Australia? Yes.
That's certainly been the argument of the West Australian government.
Look, certainly. And, you know, when you look at the federal government's nearly, you know, $500 million cut from Aboriginal affairs right across the country, the roll-on impact in lots of different areas is having an impact. But let's look at the individual communities here. And you know, certainly as Sue has said, that it is about sustainability, and these communities are trying to look for ways to be able to do that. But if they haven't been included in a respectful way to be at the table to discuss their own future, it doesn't bode well for ongoing economics either.
Mitch Fifield, I'm sure you'll say this is a matter for the West Australian government. That doesn't mean you can't have an opinion.
Look, I think no one would question the Prime Minister's deep personal commitment to Indigenous Australians. And we...
Well, Noel Pearson did after this decision was announced.
And we, as a government, respect the connection that Indigenous people have with their land. I think there have been some crossed wires here on this particular issue. The Commonwealth Government is not closing down any communities. All we're doing in Western Australia is what we've done in other jurisdictions, is pass responsibility for municipal services to the state government. It's the situation in all Australian communities, other than some Indigenous communities, that it's state and local governments that have municipal responsibility.
So is that our hands are clean argument? We don't like it, but someone else is doing it?
No, it's just the facts, and that responsibility will transfer from the middle of this year. The Commonwealth is giving $90 million up front to the West Australian Government to assist with that transition, and my understanding is that the West Australian Government is going to engage in a period of consultation for 12 months, that the existing arrangements will at least be in place for 12 months. So we as a Commonwealth Government aren't doing anything other than ensuring that Indigenous Australians receive their municipal services the same way everyone else does, which is from state and local government.
Just a brief observation on this, though. I mean, I can remember Mal Brough, a Conservative Indigenous Affairs Minister for Conservative Coalition Government, arguing the case for outstations and making the point that even though they're remote and away from the larger communities, that is in fact a good thing, because it means that people can get away from, let's say, in the contemporary space, the ice epidemic, in that period, drugs and alcohol and violence. Is there been a reversal of that position, philosophically, in your government?
No, look, I think that there are great advantages to rural, regional and remote living. And you're right, that in some circumstances you can have people out of harm's way. So we, as a Commonwealth Government, are not dictating, and in fact we have no say over where these communities should be and how they should be configured. That's a matter that the Western Australian Government will be consulting with the local community.
Alannah.
Well, Mitch, really, I mean, for over 30 years, this has been a Commonwealth responsibility. And of course, there's always room for negotiation, exactly where that line be drawn. But what happened? You threw a lump of money at Colin Barnett. He thought, wow, I'll take this. And then announced he was going to close down 150 communities and basically keep the money. And can I just pick up this? The fundamental problem here is this has been done without any discussion with the Aboriginal people by the Commonwealth or by the state. I went out in the last couple of weeks. I've been going out to the Western Desert and to these Pilbara communities. I mean, we have got people living on the people that live in these communities. Many of them have been there. Were thrown off the land in 1968 when there was a massive upheaval with the equal wage case, and most pastoralists chucked people off the land. So they have got this sense that they have now got their place, and suddenly they read in the West Australian that 150 communities are going to be closed. No one's talked to them. They hear the Prime Minister say that this is them living on country is a lifestyle choice. Can I tell you, the profoundness of the pain. I mean, these are people who went through that experience in 1968, whose families understand that experience that they went through in 1968, and now feel that they are potentially going to be thrown off the country for the third time. I mean, it is just completely, it's morally unacceptable, but it's also completely and utterly impractical. Completely impractical. That we're talking about 12,000 people in Western Australia. Where are you going to put them? On the edge of Halls Creek, Fitzroy Crossing. How's that going to deliver a better economic outcome? How's that going to deliver?
I just want to quickly hear Sue on those points. A lifestyle choice. Was that a poor way of actually making the case?
Look, for a lot of these people in these remote communities, it's not about lifestyle. It's about place. And so that is a bad choice of words, really. But one of the things that Alannah said was, if you are going to look to relocate these people, where are you going to relocate them to? And if you're going to relocate them to towns such as Kalgoorlie or Broome, do those places have the infrastructure and services necessary to be able to take the people? So we need to be thinking about what it means if we are going to be looking at relocation.
And Jody, can I just make one? It's just, sorry, I should have said it. The fundamental problem that we've had is that white fellas have got to stop telling black fellas how they're going to live their life. I mean, that's the mistake we've been making, and we are not going to make any progress until we actually pay Aboriginal people the respect to have a say in their own destiny.
Malarndirri.
Just going on what Sue, and totally, absolutely agree, Alannah, but just with Kalgoorlie, for example, we heard from there with the business of the Chamber of Commerce that they were asking that very question, and coming back to your issue of economics, that is an obvious one. But again, if the conversation is happening around people without including people, then of course it's going to be an absolute mess.
Mitch Fifield, lifestyle choice. What Prime Minister's choice of words, was that a big mistake?
No, I think the Prime Minister was seeking to make the point that there are obviously challenges in providing services in remote and regional areas, but the important point, I think, is that the West Australian Government is going to be engaging in a year's consultation with communities. We are not, as a Commonwealth, doing anything to close communities down. As I say, we are simply transferring municipal responsibilities, which everywhere else belong to states and local government, to state and local government in Indigenous communities.
I'm sorry to those people who've got their hands up. We haven't got time to come to you because we've just, I'm told we're over time. So that is all we have time for tonight. Come back and ask those questions another time. Please thank our panel, Sue McCluskey, Alannah McTiernan, Peter Greste, Malarndirri, McCarthy and Mitch Fifield. Thank you. Now, next Monday, Q&A will be live from Melbourne with the Trade Minister, Andrew Robb, who successfully clinched free trade deals, 3 of them, with Korea, Japan and China. The former Labor Speaker of the House, Anna Burke. The man they call the human headline, controversial broadcaster Darren Hinch. And the English stand-up comic Stephen K. Amos. Until next week's Q&A, good night.